Texas law that grants the authority to arrest illegal immigrants. The DOJ says the law violates the U.S. Constitution. It's warning Abbott to back down from enforcing it. The measure, known as Senate Bill 4, is set to take effect in March.
Abbott reacted by accusing the Biden administration of, quote, destroying America. Abbott on X said not only does the administration fail to enforce current U.S. immigration laws, it now wants to stop Texas from enforcing laws against illegal immigration. A powerful ocean storm is driving towering waves onto the California coastline. The wild weather is triggering flooding and warning. Took responsibility yesterday for a pair of tragic incidents. The military admitted to launching 2 strikes at a refugee camp that killed some civilians on Christmas Eve.
The military says fighter jets fired missiles hitting buildings next to their intended targets.
The other incident was the friendly fire deaths of 3 Israeli hostages killed on December 15th in Gaza City.
The military says the hostages tried to signal that they posed no harm. Some allies are hiding their cooperation with the U.S. The U.S. created a joint maritime force to protect ships passing through the Red Sea from attacks by Houthi rebels in Yemen. The force is composed of 20 nations, but 8 of those haven't acknowledged their contributions nor allowed the U.S. to. For analysis, we're joined by Senior Fellow at the Center for Security Policy, Grant Newsham. Grant, good to have you back on the show. Why do you suspect these countries aren't acknowledging their contributions to Biden's Joint Task Force, Operation Prosperity Guardian?
I think part of the reason is that they're more afraid of the Iranians, more afraid of some of the countries in the Middle East, and they're really not very respectful of the United States. This is a big change. You don't exactly have people rushing to join this naval task force. It's just a loss of confidence, really, in American leadership. Is I think how I would put it. And as I say, there is that concern about being seen as actually pro-Israel or somehow being on Israel's side. But at the end of the day, it tracks back to really a lack of respect for the United States.
All right, and how could this lack of unity we're talking about be interpreted by the international community, especially adversaries of the United States? Maybe you can expand on that.
Well, I think they would look at it and they would say that the Americans are afraid of the Houthis. And if you're afraid of the Houthis, actually, and by consequence, that the Houthis are not afraid of the Americans, nobody's afraid of the U.S. The Iranians aren't, who are basically supporting the Houthis, or are the Houthis. The Chinese aren't. They're buying a ton of Iranian oil that is funding what the Chinese are doing. The Chinese are all in for Hamas. They have a no-limits partnership with Russia in the Ukraine. So nobody's afraid of the United States. And as I said earlier, there's just not this respect for U.S. leadership. So nobody's too eager to come out too public, and the contributions really do not amount to much, unfortunately.
And let's come back to this Operation Prosperity Guardian. What effect does the lack of support have on the efficacy of this operation?
Well, if you're going to play the game the Americans are, which is really trying to swat away arrows being shot at you, you need enough resources. You need enough ships, missiles, radar to go in there to hit them. And you better hope that one doesn't slip through. So as long as we're going to play this game, you're going to need a lot of resources. And if you ever go after the Houthis and potentially the Iranians at some point, you're going to need a lot more material support, that ships, people, missiles, sensors, and the targeting systems, and you're going to need the political support. And when people don't want their names to be revealed, it suggests there's not a whole lot of political support. So I'm afraid that our enemies look at this and they see opportunity here, and this is not going to end up well.
Now, Grant, the U.S. has enough military strength to protect the Red Sea shipping route independently. The Houthi rebels aren't an enormous force. Why is it important for there to be joint international cooperation here, as opposed to the U.S. going about it independently?
But once again, as noted, I'm not so sure that we do have the ability to close down the Red Sea or protect it. We might, but the U.S. Navy is really stretched to its limits. Has a lot of things to do elsewhere in the world, Asia not least. So that really is what it comes down to, is that we don't really have the resources. We don't have the Navy that we used to have. and it has just got too much to do now.
Got it. And coming to shipping giant Maersk, they're resuming trade through the Red Sea, where the Houthis are attacking these ships. How soon could we see a return to normalcy at this key shipping route?
Well, that's hard to say. It's whenever the Iranians want us to return to normalcy. We'll see how that works, because they are behind this. And going back to your earlier question, is that this all potentially could expand. This isn't just a question of taking out some ragtag rebels. This is the Iranians at work. And if this expands to include Iran, it becomes a much bigger fight and a much bigger war. So you'd have to ask Tehran when the Red Sea is going to be safe again. I don't see it happening anytime soon, but they may be happy just to have really stirred things up. You'll notice Iran threatened to close the Straits of Gibraltar and the Mediterranean Sea. So we'll see how this goes.
And Grant, just lastly, I know you're not an election pundit, but I'm wondering how you think this issue, this maritime trade issue, will play out in the election this coming year.
Well, I think it's more a question, rather than trade, I think it's one really of whether or not America's enemies are deterred by what the United States does, by what the United States is, by who's in charge in the United States. And you have to ask, well, how many wars were we involved in? How many wars did our enemies start during the last administration? Zero. How many did they start this administration? Well, we're in at least two now, maybe 2.5, and there may be another one coming. So it very much does depend who is in charge in the United States. There was a lot of laughter about the adults being in charge once the Biden administration came in. Well, look at how well the adults have done. They've gotten us into these wars that don't show any sign of ending, and our enemies are emboldened.
All right, Grant Newsham, retired Marine Colonel and Senior Fellow at the Center for Security Policy. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks very much.
خلي كل واحدة تمشي في الشارع تلبس طرحة. كل واحدة تمشي. وأنا قلت له يعني إذا الواحد قال هذا الكلام بيقولوا رجعنا لأيام الحاكم بأمر الله اللي كان بيخلي الناس ما يمشوش بالنهار ويمشوا بالليل. وأنا في رأيي إن كل واحد في بيته هو اللي ينفذ هذا الكلام.
Now, in that video, the president of Egypt and most people in the audience, you might notice, they're wearing Western suits. The concept of forcing women to wear hijabs is so outlandish that the audience bursts into laughter. Now, Nasser wasn't necessarily free from blame either. He plays a key role in all this as well. But we'll delve into that in a minute. First, let me show you something else. This is Iran in the 1970s. With the styles and dress, you could easily mistake some of these from being in California at the time. Women studied at the universities, they wore bikinis at the beaches. Some of these were taken just before the Islamic Revolution in 1979 that saw Ayatollah Khomeini come into power and forced a new system of extreme religious fundamentalism. Many people are confused when they see the fashions of Tehran just a few decades ago. Well, if you were to go to some other Muslim countries today, you'd find it's still like that. You'll still find modern cities. You'll find people whose lifestyles are not significantly different from in the West. A lot of them don't have the backwards look that's too often associated with Muslim countries. So how did Iran go from looking a little different from a Western country to where it is now with what we're told is the extreme religious fundamentalism? Well, the religion didn't technically change. The politics changed. And that political change brings us back to the Muslim Brotherhood. With the global movements of communism in the West, we talk about Karl Marx. In the Muslim world, the man regarded as the equivalent for Karl Marx was Sayyid Qutb. And from him was born the modern authoritarian Islamist state. And from him as well emerged what we know today as Islamist terrorism. But for people who understand his system, they don't call it Islam. They call it Islamism. It's political Islam. It's Islamic socialism. Sayyid Qutb was a leading member of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood in the 1950s and 1960s. He was born in 1906. He studied socialism literature in the 1920s and 1930s. He studied abroad in the United States for a couple years in the late 1940s. And he joined the Muslim Brotherhood when he returned to Egypt. Now, his equivalents to the Communist Manifesto were two books. These were Milestones, and the other one was In the Shade of the Quran. According to the 2005 book, The Saudi Enigma, A History by Pascal Minaret, leftist Islamic scholar Ali al-Umayyad described the Muslim Brotherhood's new brand of Islam as one that concerns itself with communism, socialism, nationalism, liberalism, and all the currents from the West. What Qutb did was reinterpreted a few key elements of Islam through the lens of totalitarian socialism and violent communist revolution. These were the ideas of Jahiliyyah, Jihad, and Sharia. Now, Jahiliyyah refers to the idea of an ignorance of religious truth. Muslims use this to refer to society before the spread of Islam. But Qutb reinterpreted the meaning of this in order to push Muslims into violent struggle. He argued that all the world is under Jahiliyyah. It extended even to secular Islam, to any form of the religion that did not enforce the religion through the state. And he called on Muslims to die for this struggle, the jihad. Now, to make this jump, Qutb also had to pervert the concept of jihad. Now, the idea of jihad is taken these days as being synonymous with an external holy war. But the term just means to struggle or to fight. The idea used to be interpreted as a type of internal striving for self-perfection. There was a so-called defensive jihad. But Qutb expanded this into a concept of offensive jihad. And he targeted not just non-Muslims, but also Muslims as well. And he argued that any system, even under Muslim states, any system that did not follow his reinterpretation of this religion needed to be overthrown. And the idea of what that state would look like, well, that came through his perversion of the idea of Sharia. In the same way, Qutb's basic theory is that the society of Jahiliyyah is being forced on people and has rendered them unfree. And violent jihad is then touted as the tool to liberate people from this. When Qutb's writings were first published, many Muslim leaders condemned his views as heresy. He was manipulating religion to build the form of a socialist government that he wanted. A Jamestown Foundation report in 2005 notes that many Muslim leaders felt that Qutb had gone too far, and his influential work, Milestones, they say, was denounced, both by the spiritual leader of the Ikhwan and by Al-Azhar University, which condemned the book as heretical. It was heresy. Now, in order to build this system of government, Qutb's teachings were taken as justification to kill, and regardless, again, of whether the people are Muslims or non-Muslims. Essentially, what Qutb did was just rewrite Islam into a socialist system of government. The identities of the state and the religion became meshed together. The result is that the socialist leader is then given absolute power over not just the society, but over the faith of the people as well. And because of that, criticizing the state is likewise treated as religious blasphemy. You can be killed for it. And he reinterpreted the violent revolution seen in nearly every other communist movement into being a type of religious war. Now, of course, Qutb's ideas were too extreme for most Muslims, and even too extreme for most other socialists. When the monarchy of Egypt under the pro-Western Muhammad Ali dynasty was overthrown in 1952 by the socialist-leaning Free Officers movement, Qutb and the Muslim Brotherhood had played a key role. But after the revolution, Nasser, whose speech we showed earlier, decided to secularize Egypt, and he actually suppressed the Muslim Brotherhood. Qutb was later imprisoned, and the Muslim Brotherhood actually tried to assassinate the Egyptian president. He actually wrote his books in prison, and he was hanged in 1966. Now, Qutb's death, meanwhile, put him and his ideas in the spotlight. the murderous elements of Qutb's teachings tend to depend on his later interpreter, and that was Abdullah Azzam, who said the death of, quote, pure innocent souls would be needed to bring about his system. Among Azzam's disciples was Osama bin Laden, the former head of Al-Qaeda. And it wasn't just bin Laden and Al-Qaeda that used his teachings. Qutb's concepts of Islamism and violent revolution are regarded as the doctrine of Islamic terrorism. And among the many groups that follow his teachings are ISIS, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and Hamas. It was also Qutb's ideas that tied Islamist terrorism to the global communist movement. The history of this merging of the religion with socialism began taking root in the Cold War. It was a time that has odd similarities that we're now seeing taking place. At the time, the Soviet Union was backing the Arab world in attacks against Israel. From the 1960s onward, Palestinian terrorism has had strong support from the Chinese Communist regime. Former Palestinian Liberation who died in 2004, he visited China 14 times. He met with CCP leaders, including Mao Zedong and Jiang Zemin. The CCP offered Arafat's forces weapons, money, training, and guidance on strategy. The Soviets as well fostered the PLO, as is recalled by defector Ion Mihai Pacepa, former lieutenant general and acting chief of Communist Romania's Foreign Intelligence Service. In his article, Russian Footprints, Pacepa quoted the head of Soviet Foreign Intelligence, Alexander Sakharovsky. In today's world, when nuclear arms have made military force obsolete, terrorism should become our main weapon. Sakharovsky had a world map in his office, Pacepa said, covered in red flags, each representing an aircraft hijacking. Sakharovsky told him the tactic of hijacking aircraft was his own invention, according to Pacepa. The PLO was responsible for many of these hijackings, according to the Spectre of Communism. The Romanian communist regime under Nicolae Ceausescu supplied the Palestinians with guns and ammo as well. The Czechoslovakian communist regime was supplying them with plastic explosives as the PLO carried out the hijackings and the bombings of commercial airlines. And none of this should come to any surprise. Terrorism has always been a tool of communism. In fact, it's one of the core tenets of communism. We can turn to Title 22 of the United States Code for the exact definition. It holds that the term terrorism means premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents. For communists, these tactics go back to their beginnings with the French Revolution in the late 1700s and the reign of terror under the Committee of Public Safety. It was the guillotine. It was the practice of sending peasants onto barges and then sinking them into frozen rivers. It was tying people together and shooting them with cannonballs with chains tied between them. It was the political violence of the Jacobins. And this same tool of political terror was carried on with the ideas of Gracchus Babeuf and directly into the teachings of Karl Marx in the ideas of violent revolution. It was the same ideas, even with the socialist and the anarchist terrorist attacks in the United States in the late 1800s, which culminated with the bombing in 1886. The chief of police at the time, Michael J. Schack, wrote his book, Anarchy and Anarchists, that the doctrine behind the killings in the United States was founded upon the teachings of Karl Marx and his disciples, and it aims directly at the complete destruction of all forms of government and religion. It offers no solution of the problems which will arise when society as we understand it shall disappear, but contents itself with declaring that the duty at hand is tearing down, that the work of building up must come later. Terrorism is a tool, not just for socialist revolution, not just for gaining power, but to also keep power afterwards. It aids in the tyrannical control of a society. Just A.M. Rouleau wrote in the 1949 book, Delusion and Mass Delusions, that man is weakened by fear, fright, and terror. He readily accepts any catchwords and opinions which promise security. He adds that the best examples are seen in small, isolated communities where a pathological fanatic, driven by exaggerated religious zeal, fascinates his fellow citizens and makes them fearful. He injects them with his delusions, as for instance in the perpetration of a sanctioned religious murder. And through this tool of fear and terror, he adds, the collective delusion finds fertile ground for growth.
All characters. Political slogans used by the Chinese Communist Party to promote the so-called core socialist values. Words that brought back bad memories for a Chinese student who goes by the name Apple.
They almost put it everywhere on the street in China to it's almost like a brainwashing, and then we everyone has to remember those phrases when they were in primary school. That's why we're here today to respond to that, to put out our graffiti art.
She said they're contacting the artists whose work was originally on the wall to see if their artwork can be recovered. Jake, a local in the area and who used to live in Beijing, said he was shocked to see the wall painted over.
No volume.
The Hamas terrorists, and also everybody else can call them terrorists. Why can't the BBC? That's why we're here. My brother lives in Israel. He's spending most of his time in a shelter with his family. That's not a way to live. We want to live in peace. All we want is peace. Leave Israel alone and we'll be happy.
We're here outside the BBC to protest against BBC refusing to call Hamas terrorists terrorists and solely referring to them as militants. I think it's quite clear their despicable behaviour and the support they've summoned across the world completely warrants them to be known as terrorists rather than solely militants for the kind of despicable actions they've had.
I'm a Jewish student in the UK. We haven't had a lot of support in Israel, especially in universities. So I'm just here to show my support for the Jewish and the Israeli community. I have a lot of family in Israel as well, so doing everything I can to show my support.
Last week, a BBC Radio Derby sports reporter quit his job over the terminology used by the BBC. The Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, several Conservative ministers, and the Labour leader have hit out at the broadcaster's editorial line. 4 senior lawyers have said the BBC is taking sides with Hamas by calling them militants rather than terrorists. But veteran BBC foreign correspondent John Simpson has said calling someone a terrorist means you're taking sides. A statement from the BBC board said it expects and welcomes
You're taking sides, but what
of the
are
way
they?
it covers the
They're terrorists.
Israel-Hamas conflict. The BBC said it has received complaints about its coverage of the conflict, and there have been accusations of bias from both sides. Jane Worrell, NTD News, London.
December defense budget bill rejecting publicizing UAP information. In tonight's special edition of Capitol Report, we'll bring you our interview with Justine Eisenhinker, who heads up geopolitics and UAP research at the Malone Institute, an organization whose goal, among other things, is to bring integrity to this subject and to government. I spoke with her before the House rejected the Senate's push to amend the defense bill to require UAP info be made public. Justine Eisenhinker, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, Justine, you've actually been writing on Substack with Dr. Robert Malone regarding the United States government concealment of UFOs, otherwise known as unidentified anomalous phenomenon is what they're calling it now. These UAPs are subject of a lot of skepticism. You have a bipartisan effort between Republican Senator Mike Rounds, Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer introducing a bill. I want to play some sound of Chuck Schumer on the Senate floor and get your reaction.
Finally, on UAEs. While it's not related to China, House Republicans are also attempting to kill another common-sense bipartisan measure passed by the Senate, which I was proud to co-sponsor with Senator Rounds as the lead sponsor, to increase transparency around what the government does and does not know about unidentified aerial phenomena. Unidentified aerial phenomena generate intense curiosity for many Americans, and the risk for confusion and misinformation is high if the government isn't willing to be transparent.
What kind of misinformation could result if Congress is not willing or does not act to open up these records?
Well, I would say that the misinformation is a continual disinformation campaign that's been unrolling for the last 80 years, as David Grush has alleged when he did his interview on News Nation. And that disinformation has been to effectively say that if you have seen something or come across something or experienced something that is inexplicable, then there's something wrong with you and that the phenomenon doesn't exist. And that has been a stigma that's been associated with UFO sightings, what they're now calling UAPs, the destigmatized terminology.
Do you think this is by design, perhaps?
I honestly think that it is by design by a certain contingent within the government. Well, I do think it's by design. The why is the question that keeps coming up, and we don't know the why. Why would you not open up all the information that you have and say, okay, here's everything we have. This doesn't exist and it makes no sense. Or, yes, we have craft, we have alien bodies, we don't know what these are. Yet, the reason that they're not doing that is the question that everyone is asking. The government should be comfortable unless there's something nefarious going on. And I think that's where the confusion with people lies, is that if the government was doing something that was benign, then there's no problem sharing it. You still have the intelligence community, in hand with the Department of Defense, withholding information from the people that pay their salaries.
Is this, or could it be, like the fox guarding the henhouse?
Absolutely. That's the excuse they've had for decades, is that it's about national security. Well, why is it about national security? And
it has eerie similarities to something else in more recent times,
yes,
doesn't it?
Very much so.
In terms of, just locked down for a few months for the good of your neighbor and social distance and things like that. That found out it didn't actually help.
The playbook that the government has been using for the last 80 years was refined and, effectively put into action very well with COVID. The control of the message through the manipulation of media, of social media, of influencing people, of terrorizing people, all of that has its roots in what they've done on the UFO disinformation campaign that they've been running. And that just triggers my interest, because suddenly you're asking yourself, well, I now know through Robert and through the tons of research that I've done and the conferences that I've gone to with him,
why does Area 51
exist? Lied openly, brazenly. And why would you use your playbook, if you're telling the truth? You don't need that. You're just, naked before all, so to speak. But again, that manipulation strikes me as, what are you hiding?
Do you think there are some lawmakers that simply do not want transparency on this UAP topic?
I think that's absolutely the case.
Why?
There's two reasons. The first, David Grush alluded to on his podcast with Joe Rogan recently, which is there are people that like to be the power brokers of knowledge. They like to be the all-knowing, all-seeing, all-powerful people in our government that have all the information, but you can't have any. And that apparently is some big ego boost, and that I've heard from other sources too. When it comes to, what the direct motivation, no doubt there's financial motivation involved. There certainly are many defense contracting companies that are sponsoring a number of the Republicans that push back against this particular Schumer amendment. And, it's unclear whether that actually happened or not, but that is what it's leading to, and none of them are coming out and objected to any of those allegations. And the dead silence is frustrating for all of us, because we were led to believe, when I say we, those that are following the subject with an avid interest, were led to believe that the Schumer amendment and the bill that the House passed very recently that contained the Schumer amendment, as well as Tim Burchett's 1.5-page amendment, were bipartisan, and that there was broad consensus that that's what we wanted. Turns out, and a lot of us were blindsided that what they actually passed was a very narrow scope of the Schumer Amendment that only really referred to the National Archives, stripped out eminent domain, stripped out the review panel, subpoena powers. It muted it.
Political connotation. The BBC reported the students appear to have been issued with an £800 fine for graffiti and fly posting. Soon after the slogans were put up, new graffiti appeared, countering the message. People added words to what originally said fairness and justice, so it read no fairness, no justice, and so on. Some commented it became a canvas of anti-CCP dissent. Exiled Chinese author Ma Jian told us his first reaction when he saw the 24 characters on the wall.
These young students don't know the history of the Chinese Communist Party because since 1949, violent revolution, the opposite of civility, has been the values taught in China. So children who grew up in that environment, as well as their parents and grandparents, all these generations grew up holding the opposite values as we do today.
Human rights campaigners said they stood in support of the dissenting graffiti, with Benedict Rogers saying, "I wholeheartedly applaud, support and stand in solidarity with the brave mainland Chinese who stood up against this and responded with counter-graffiti in Brick Lane." Jane Worrell, NTG News, London.
Were arriving in the UK illegally via small boats, and there were more migrants in those boats. I mean, the average for August alone is 58 migrants per boat. So it was clear that the boats were getting bigger and that possibly someone is manufacturing these boats for the actual purpose of people smuggling. And so after doing some research, it became apparent that Turkey has now taken over production of these massive inflatables for the purpose of people smuggling. And really, it wasn't too hard to find some of these boats being sold on Facebook, for example, by legitimate companies. For example, the one that I spoke to, its main business is making PVC floors and tiles and doors and windows, but they were also running this sort of side hustle in making these boats.
And as for the boats, how much do they cost, and how quickly could a smuggler get one after they've ordered one?
Well, I mean, it's relatively
It's an
easy
invasion.
for them to order these boats, and it's